The storm seemed to want to tear the roof off the old cabin. Outside, in the darkness of the forest, a figure was advancing through the mud, each step enveloped by the sound of rain and the weight of decision. The young man was gripping the gun tightly, breathing through his mouth, his eyes covered by a bandana. Sitting duck, he thought. After all, who could react in a place as forgotten as Echo Ridge? But what he didn't know is that inside that simple house, a war veteran, forgotten by the world, was waking up from a light sleep to the sound of an old system of cans and improvised wires. Will Granger wasn't just an old man. He was a living memory of battles no one else remembers. And that night, something much bigger than a common robbery was about to happen. Will did not get up immediately. He just opened his eyes. And there, in the darkness of the poorly lit room, time began to go back like a silent avalanche. The metallic sound of cans hitting the ground wasn't just a warning. It was a callback to a war that never ended. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from memory. Every bone ached, every breath was heavy. Not by the invader, but for the years he fought to continue existing after he had survived. Outside, the young criminal approached, ignoring the cold that penetrated the soaked fabric of his jacket. He thought it would be an easy night, one of those stories of quick robbery and escape. What he didn't know was that the house he was standing in was full of ghosts. Not the ones that scare, but the ones that protect. Ghosts of secret missions, of lost comrades, of hand-to-hand combat where there was no room for error. Will adjusted the blanket over his legs with an automatic gesture, as he had done every night since the arthritis had combined with the trauma. The glazed eyes looked at the ceiling, but saw something else. The forest of Vietnam. The smell of gunpowder. The muffled scream of a young comrade struck to the side. He swallowed hard, but said nothing. Silence. As it always was. Maybe you've already felt the weight of being ignored, judged, left aside. So I ask you, share in the comments what has touched you the most so far. Really. Every word you say helps this channel to continue telling stories that the world insists on forgetting. Like the video if it made sense to you. And if you want to follow more stories like this, of pain, courage, and change, subscribe. Your participation here makes all the difference, not only for me, but for anyone who needs to be reminded that there is still honor in the midst of oblivion. And that night, as the intruder opened the back door, unaware of what awaited him, Will had already made a decision, and there was no going back. He walked along the uneven stone sidewalk with short steps, always with his eyes fixed on the ground, as if he knew he was not welcome. The Echo Ridge grocery store was 2 blocks off the main dirt road, and it was the only place Will Granger still ventured to pop in from time to time. He never talked much. He asked for things with gestures or a slight nod of his head. I paid in cash. He would leave before any conversation could begin. And yet, the eyes followed him to the door. Eyes that judged him without knowing even a tenth of his story. In the line, people moved away subtly. Not out of fear, but out of indifference. Some whispered, amused by the old cap he wore, with a military symbol almost faded by time. Once, a child pointed and asked his mother why that strange old man walked around with a coin hanging around his neck. The woman simply pulled the boy by the arm and said, "That guy is crazy. He's always talking to the trees." What no one knew, or if they did, they chose to ignore it, is that this coin was one of the highest honors awarded for bravery in combat, received on a mission that never entered the public record, because many of those who returned did not return in one piece. Will was one of the few who carried in his body and mind the pieces of those who couldn't return. But to Echo Ridge, he was just another crazy old man who lost his way. The nights were worse. The silence of the forest was not calming. He did not sleep. He just rested his eyes with the shotgun resting next to the bed. Any loud noise would make him jump up, his heart racing and his lungs tearing for air. Some mornings, he would light the lantern and go down to the shed at the back of the property. There, an entire world slept in wooden boxes. Old letters, newspaper clippings, faded medals, carefully folded uniforms. And in the center, in a trunk covered by a black tarp, were the equipment he had built himself from radio parts and military scrap, sensors, wires, hooks, and rudimentary traps that seemed obsolete, until someone made the mistake of trying to cross his line. Will didn't like to remember, but the memory came anyway. A smell, a crack in the wood, a heavy raindrop, anything could trigger the invisible trigger that dragged him back into the jungle. He saw the faces of his fallen companions, felt the wet earth mixed with blood under their boots, heard the muffled screams of those calling for help. And all of this came back in a fraction of a second, as if the war lived just behind the retina. One summer morning, he tried to talk to the new pastor in town, just to get something off his chest. But before he could say anything, he heard, "You need prayer. Your spirit is troubled." That was the last day he tried to open up to anyone. From then on, he spoke only to the trees, because at least they didn't interrupt him. And yet, every single day he did the same routine. He lit the wood stove, made weak coffee in an iron mug, sat on the porch chair, and watched the grass grow. It was his way of telling the world that he was still there, that he was still resisting, even with pain in his joints, his eyesight failing, his hearing impaired. He was there. One day, a group of teenagers invaded the property at night to play a prank. They hung a plastic skull on the fence and laughed out loud. Will didn't react. He just watched them from the window, in silence. But the next day, when they returned to repeat the prank, the gate had already been reinforced, and the sensors had been turned on. No noise was heard, just a scream of fright followed by hurried footsteps of escape. None of them ever came back. The truth is that behind that facade of seclusion was someone deeply hurt. Not by the bullets he took, but by the oblivion he suffered. A man who fought for his country, and then had to fight to not be swallowed up by it. It wasn't pride that made him keep all that. It was survival. Every thread, every piece, every routine was a silent reminder that he still had control over something. And while the town went on with its life, parties in the community hall, Sunday runs in the park, fervent evening services, Will remained invisible. Unless, of course, something went wrong. A broken fence, a strange noise at night, or rumors of a stranger prowling the area. Then, yes, they remembered that the old man from the cabin existed, and that perhaps it would be better not to mess with him. But what they didn't know, and perhaps never imagined, was that at that very moment, one of those outsiders had made the worst decision of his life. The cabin was about to become the stage for a story that no one could ignore. Not this time. Write in the comments. The pain that no one sees is sometimes the strongest. I want to know if this makes sense to you too. Rick walked in with his body hunched over, his breathing ragged, and his finger pressing the trigger, as if that were enough to make him feel in control. The smell of wet wood mixed with the old sweat from the coat he had been wearing for days. The gun trembled slightly in his hand. He looked around, but saw nothing but shadows and old furniture. The room was small, stifling, with damp marked walls and old photographs covered in a thin layer of dust. Each step echoed louder than he would have liked. The floorboards creaked, as if screaming to alert someone. But he moved forward anyway. In the chair in front of him, a motionless figure. It looked like someone sleeping. This is too easy, he thought. But something inside him hesitated, as if the whole scene was too arranged. Will was already there, fully conscious. His still body was just part of a distraction. He had positioned himself in the darkness, close to the kitchen wall, where the sound of the rain masked his slow, controlled breathing. It was like returning to the tunnels, the caves, the nighttime ambushes where every second counted for a life. Only now, the setting was his own home. And the one threatening the peace was not a foreign enemy, but a hungry, arrogant boy. Rick didn't know it, but this was the territory of someone who had trained men to survive in jungles, with traps hidden under leaves and mud. And that house, apparently fragile, was in fact the last stronghold of a man who still carried all the mechanisms of war within him. The difference? Outside, no one knew about it. And whoever entered didn't leave the same either. He raised his gun. He aimed it at the silhouette. He spoke softly, hoarsely. "Get up. Now." No answer. Just the distant hiss of an old radio coming from the back of the room. He took a deep breath. He approached slowly. 1 step, 2. The third made the floor give way slightly. And in that instant, Will moved. Fast, silent, precise. Rick heard something to his right, turned reflexively, and that was the final mistake. In 2 movements, his wrist was twisted with brutal force. The gun fell. A blow to his knee knocked him off balance. And before he could scream, his face was pressed to the ground, his arm pinned behind his back, and a bootlace was tied around his wrist like handcuffs. "What are you?" he managed to mutter, his face covered in dust and his eyes wide with fear. Will didn't answer. He just tightened the knot. At the back of the room, the camera on a stack of books recorded everything. Not out of vanity, but as a precaution. He knew that the next morning he would have to prove his version of events, as he had had to do so many times in his life. Rick began to cry. Not from pain, but from shock. He never imagined that he would be held hostage by a man who could be his grandfather, a man who didn't speak, didn't shout, didn't threaten. He just acted with the coldness of someone who had seen hell and survived. Meanwhile, outside, the rain was getting heavier. The drops were pounding the roof like soft bullets, and the world was still in ignorance. The town was asleep. The sheriff was asleep. The neighbors were asleep too. Everyone was calm, as if nothing was happening just a few miles away. And yet, in that cabin forgotten by fate, a silent war had just been won. But the cruelest thing about all this wasn't the intruder's fright, it was what happened next. The police took hours to respond to the call. When they arrived, the officers' looks were of disbelief, not because Will had arrested someone, but because he was still alive, lucid, and steady. "That gentleman over there," one of them asked mockingly, "did you do all this alone?" Will just turned his back. There was nothing more to explain. The same city that ignored him now began to see what had always been there. A whole man, even after having been torn apart so many times inside. And do you know what hurt the most about all of this? It wasn't the invasion, nor the shock. It was realizing that he only started to be respected again after he had to act violently, after someone tried to kill him, as if a man's dignity needed to be proven by a confrontation, by a video recording, by a viral headline. But sometimes that's how the world works. It only looks at you when the impact is big enough to shake off indifference. And if you also feel like you've been through this, from being ignored to proving your worth in pain, comment below, "I was once invisible too." Because this kind of story isn't over yet. It's just begun. The sound of the door slamming in the wind was no longer just a common sound to Will. He woke up to it, even when he slept with his eyes open. Because in truth, he never turned it off. His body rested, but his spirit, that remained in a state of war. Every corner of the cabin had a function. The makeshift bookshelf hid an emergency exit. The thick curtains served more as camouflage than privacy. The radio hissing was not a distraction, it was to camouflage footsteps. And the cans, tied together with fishing line, were not decoration. They were the eyes that time had taken away. Will wasn't paranoid. He was trained. But the world around him forgot why. He didn't complain. He was never one to play the victim. But inside, it hurt. A lot. Seeing his own history treated as a clinical problem, his military past becoming synonymous with disorder, the word veteran carrying more distrust than respect. He had heard from a government attendant, "If you really served, why aren't you in any database?" And from a social worker, "It's common for elderly people to confuse memories with fantasies." He wanted to scream. But Will had already screamed too much, and no one heard. Life in Echo Ridge continued at a small-town pace. People who knew everyone, but didn't really know anything. The old man from the cabin became part of local folklore. Children pointed, teenagers made fun of him. Even some adults avoided him on the street, as if his silence were a threat. No one knew that he spent sleepless nights, that he woke up sweaty, panting, with his hand outstretched for a gun he no longer used. That even today, more than 50 years later, he could smell the earth wet with blood every time it rained heavily. His hands shook sometimes, not from weakness, but from holding back the impulse. The impulse to react to an explosion that no longer existed. Running when he heard quick footsteps behind him. To protect the back of your neck when someone was speaking too loudly. That wasn't weakness. It was body memory. It was the price of seeing more than he should have. From someone who survived things that not even movies can show. The story of his hospitalization was one of the cruelest chapters. A neighbor, bothered by the cans in the yard and the hanging wires, made a complaint. This man could be dangerous. That was all it took. An ambulance arrived, 2 strong nurses, and a clipboard with the word instability on it. No one asked his version of events. No one cared about his service record. He was taken away as if he were a broken object. He spent 48 hours in a psychiatric center, surrounded by voices that didn't even know his name. He was only released because a doctor, who also happened to be a veteran, recognized the coin around his neck. Retirement? An even more bitter chapter. His squadron files had been lost in a base fire decades ago. When he asked for a review of his benefits, the government demanded proof he no longer had. Burned documents, dead contacts, discredited memories. Without valid records, the benefit will be temporarily suspended. And so, a hero became a cancelled number. He lived for months with an empty refrigerator, an overdue electricity bill, and his dignity in tatters. And when the attack happened, when that young man burst into the cabin, thinking he would find a frail, lonely old man, it wasn't fear that Will felt. It was the old code resurfacing. The mission to protect, to resist, to survive. But more than that, it was the accumulated weight of years of being ignored, exploding in a single moment. He didn't react out of instinct. He reacted out of justice. That night wasn't about defending himself. It was about proving, to himself and to the world, that he was still someone, that his life still mattered. Even with the intruder immobilized, even with everything recorded, even with the police present, no one apologized for calling him crazy. No one from the government knocked on his door. The local newspaper published a small article, without a photo, and the next day, the city went on as if nothing had happened. But inside Will, something changed. For the first time in a long time, he slept. Not deeply, not without nightmares, but he slept with the certainty that, even alone, he was still capable of fighting. And the most curious thing is that this kind of strength is not seen in the arm, nor in age. It lives in the look, in the silence, in the things that most people don't even notice, because there are pains that the world doesn't want to see. And yet they exist. And they hurt. They hurt every day. Write in the comments. I also carry scars that no one sees. Because sometimes, just by saying it out loud, we start to heal inside. Rick was still shaking when he was pushed against the cold floor, his face dirty with dust and fear. The gun was now far away. It had slid to the corner of the room and lay harmlessly, as if it had never posed any threat. The silence that followed was brutal. All that could be heard was their heavy breathing. Rick's, quick, desperate. Will's, calm, as if he had just concluded something inevitable. There was no scream, there was no outburst. Will just took a deep breath, looked at his steady hands holding the shoelaces, and remembered. He remembered the wet field where he had tied up enemy prisoners with pieces of improvised rope. He remembered the comrade who had died for trusting too much in a surrendered enemy. He remembered when he had had to kill in order not to die. All that was long ago, but still stuck to his skin. And so he did not hesitate. Not now. Rick remained motionless, trying to understand how everything had changed in seconds. An old man. An old man had knocked him down. And not only that, he had humiliated him. The way he had been dominated, tied up, neutralized, that hurt more than any punch. The shattered pride made more noise inside him than the fall. And yet, Will didn't say a word. He just looked at him with that hard face, marked by invisible scars and wars that no one had ever asked if he wanted to fight. The camera rolled on, positioned between two encyclopedias of guerrilla tactics and ancient maps. It was activated by a motion sensor when the back door was broken down. Everything had been meticulously planned. Not because Will was waiting for someone, but because he had always waited. He knew that one day the real world would cross that line again, that a new enemy would emerge, not from across the ocean, but from oblivion itself. Will struggled to his feet. His knees creaked, his spine groaned, but he stood firm. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve, went to the radio, and tuned it to the police channel. He made the call in a low, precise voice. Breakdown. Suspect restrained. No injuries. And then he hung up. Just like that. While he waited for the patrol car, which would take almost an hour to arrive, since Echo Ridge wasn't exactly a priority on the map, he returned to his chair. He sat down as if it were just another night. And maybe it was. Maybe for him, this kind of confrontation was just part of the routine, part of the reality that no one saw, part of the war that never ended. Rick tried to speak, to say something, anything. But Will just pointed with his gaze to an old photo on the shelf. In it, 4 men in uniform smiled with tired eyes. One of them was Will. The others were no longer here. You have no idea how many times I've had to survive guys like you, not as a threat, but as the harsh truth. And in that moment, for the first time, Rick stopped fighting. His body was still trapped, his face was still dirty, but his soul began to understand the kind of force he had faced. When the lights of the police car finally cut through the darkness, Rick was sitting against the wall, his eyes downcast. The 2 officers got out of the car with their usual nonchalance. One of them even laughed when he saw the scene. "Did you do this yourself?" he asked, almost mockingly. Will didn't answer. He just handed over the camera's memory card and nodded at the intruder. "The footage is there. Do whatever you have to do." The agents watched the recording, in silence. No jokes afterward. No laughter. Just the expression of someone who saw something they didn't expect. One of them even looked at Will, and not knowing how to react, simply said, "There are people who should learn from you." But Will wasn't looking for recognition, or a pat on the back. He just wanted to return to the peace he never had. And when everything seemed to be over, something unusual happened. One of the neighbors, attracted by the lights of the police car, appeared at the fence with a flashlight in his hand. It was the same man who, months before, helped sign the complaint that led to Will's forced hospitalization. He watched the scene in silence. He saw the intruder being placed in the back seat. He saw the agents greet Will with respect. And, for the first time, he lowered his eyes. There was something in the air that night. It wasn't just rain. It was a kind of silent reparation. An invisible reckoning between the past and the present. Because sometimes justice doesn't scream. It just happens. And even when no one is looking, it leaves marks. Write in the comments. There are stories that only those who have lived them understand. Because there are things that cannot be explained. They just sit down. And that changes everything. The sun hadn't even broken through the morning fog when the sheriff's car appeared, kicking up dust on the dirt road. The siren was off. Not out of respect, but out of contempt. Sheriff Julian was the kind of person who thought that a good veteran was one who kept quiet. And Will, despite his constant silence, had never exactly been submissive. When the deputy got out of the car, he took a quick look at the collected gun, the handcuffed intruder, and finally at Will. "Another crazy old man story, huh?" he grumbled. opening his notebook as if he already had a verdict in mind before even hearing the facts. But it only took the first minute of filming for his face to change. It wasn't just because of the precision of the immobilization or the calm with which Will acted. It was because of the language, the look in his eyes, the posture. Julian, even with all his arrogance, recognized something that is not taught in police academies. He recognized the war instinct, the discipline, the code. This was not an act. This was real survival. The sheriff didn't say anything else. He took the memory card, got in his car, and drove away. And then, what no one expected happened. By late afternoon, the image of Will arresting the intruder began to spread across the internet. Someone from the police station leaked the video, and a group of young people from Echo Ridge itself, who until then had been mocking the old man of the forest, turned the scene into a legend. "The ghost of the forest exists," read the caption of one post. Within a few hours, the comments multiplied. And for the first time in many years, Will Granger's name was not followed by jokes, but by admiration. The next day, 2 police cars and a news van pulled up on the dirt road. The reporters wanted to know who the man was, who at age 78 had arrested an armed criminal using only manual techniques. One of them, visibly moved, asked, "Mr. Granger, were you ever in the army?" Will simply pointed to the coin around his neck. He didn't need to say anything. The next few days were a blur. The small town became a headline-grabbing scene. A national network called for an exclusive interview. A former squadmate, now living in another state, showed up unexpectedly, his eyes filling with tears. "I thought you were dead, Will," he said, hugging the old man as if they were still young on the battlefield. But the most striking thing didn't come from the press. It came from the unexpected. It came from the look of a boy who, as he was passing by on his bike, stopped, got off, took off his cap, and simply said, "Thank you," without explaining, without asking anything. Just, "Thank you." And Will felt something inside his chest that he hadn't felt for a long time. Recognition without noise. Respect without the spotlight. Some residents, previously distant, began to pass by the fence just to leave homemade bread, a letter, a souvenir. A neighbor, the widow of a veteran, appeared with a pot of coffee and teary eyes. "My husband spoke about you. He said that you saved lives out there, and that you still had a lot to teach here." Will didn't change his routine. He still lit the wood stove in the morning. He still chopped wood with difficulty, but without asking for help. But now, when he passed through the village, people looked at him differently. No longer with fear or mockery, but with curiosity, reverence, and a hint of regret. He knew that this did not erase the decades of neglect. I knew that that momentary success would not make up for the years of neglect. But something had changed. And it wasn't just in the city. It was inside him. For the first time, Will began to feel like he was part of the world again. Not like a hero, but as a man who, even when injured, never stopped protecting what he believed in. And while the press was still trying to turn his story into a spectacle, he went back to taking care of the little things, mending the fence, fixing the radio, feeding the birds. Because deep down, his mission was never to appear. It was to survive. He went to save it. It was to resist. But now, the eyes that had previously avoided him wanted to hear what he had to say. Write in the comments. Every story needs to be heard at the right time. Because sometimes, one man's silence carries more truth than 1,000 speeches. And when someone finally listens, everything changes. The noise at the front fence interrupted the usual morning silence. Will, who was sitting on the porch with a cup of lukewarm coffee in his hands, looked slowly, without getting up. He thought it was just another curious person, someone wanting to see up close the old man who tied up a thief with his own shoelaces. But what he saw was different. 3 young men, almost boys, with their heads down, holding a basket of bread and a small envelope. None of them came too close. One of them, the youngest, seemed to be sweating even in the morning cold. And it was he who spoke first. his voice low but firm. "Mister, Will, can you teach us how to defend ourselves?" For a second, Will didn't know what to say. For years, no one had asked him for anything, much less with humility. He was used to being avoided, not sought after. He was accustomed to contempt, not reverence. She looked at the faces before her and saw something she hadn't seen since her youth. A thirst for truth. And there, in that small, silent moment, something inside him reorganized itself. He stood up slowly, as he always did, feeling the cracking of his joints that no longer had the strength they once had. He picked up the basket, thanked them with a slight nod, and invited the three of them in. The conversation that morning was not about combat techniques. It was about mentality, about decisions, about knowing when to fight, and, most importantly, when not to fight. They listened in silence. They took notes. And when they left more than just thanks. They left the beginning of a new perception that not every hero needs to shout to be heard. From then on, the invitations started coming in. First, it was the local school, which asked Will to speak about resilience and courage in a talk for high school students. He declined the first time. He didn't know if he could do it. It had been so long since he had spoken in front of a group. But the second time, something changed. Maybe it was the note he received, written by a teacher. These kids have never met anyone who faced life with such truth. The library provided the space. The auditorium was simple, with wooden chairs and cold lighting. But the place was full, not just with students. Many adults were there too. People who, before, would cross the street to avoid having to greet him. And that night, when Will stepped onto the small improvised stage, something unexpected happened. Applause. Long. Respectful. He took a deep breath, adjusted the necklace with the coin around his neck, and said, "I didn't come here to tell you war stories. I came to remind you that the hardest courage is to carry on when no one believes you're worth anything anymore." What followed was more than a lecture. It was a revelation. He spoke of the companions he had left behind, of the weight of returning and no longer being recognized, of the fear of going mad in silence, of the times he wanted to give up, but held on to the one thing he had never lost, his code of honor. And when he was done, no one could look at him the same way. The mayor heard about the event. A few days later, he showed up at the cabin, not in a suit, but with a folded shirt and a humble expression. He carried a plaque with the city's coat of arms. He read a quick, nervous speech and gave the recognition. "For the silent legacy and the courage that does not depend on uniform." Will didn't smile broadly, but his eyes shone in a way they hadn't in a long time. And there, on that balcony where so many passed by him without noticing his existence, he felt that life had begun to pulse again. Not like before, but with a new dignity. The community that had previously whispered now stopped. I listened. I would appreciate it. And sometimes I asked for advice. The simple hut became a symbol, not of greatness, but of preparation, of integrity, of resistance. And Will, who had only wanted to live in peace, now found peace every day, not because he was forgotten, but because he was finally seen. Write in the comments, honor is when the truth does not need to be explained. Because sometimes someone's greatest legacy is not in the medals, but in the silence they carry with dignity. If you've made it this far, it's because some part of this story really spoke to you. And when a story touches you, it doesn't go away. It stays. If at any point you felt that Will's journey also carries a piece of yours, leave a comment below. I felt this truth. That way I'll know that you stayed with me until the end, and that we connected beyond words. If this message resonated with you, like the video. It helps bring these stories to more people who might need to hear something like this today. And if you like this type of content, stories that have soul, that have legacy, that have silence and weight at the same time, subscribe to the channel. There is a lot that still needs to be told. By the way, There are 2 videos here that complement this subject. Click and continue with me there. We still have a lot to talk about.